If you had to choose between honor and the truth, which would you sacrifice? On the last night of January 1965, as a violent storm howled along the shores of Analyas, a police officer made the worst decision of his life. He fell asleep beside a headless corpse, and when he woke, the only thing left to him was disgrace. To conceal that failure, he drew his weapon and shot a stranger who happened to pass by, intending to swap the bodies. But fate is a ruthless executioner. The man he killed was the murderer, and the body he had lost belonged to his own flesh and blood. Welcome to a death sentence handed not to a body, but to a soul, the most bitter irony in Lebanon's criminal history. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do here. We upload new stories several times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please hit the subscribe button and turn on all notifications. Also, please gently sneak into the like button's house, take all the batteries out of their TV remote, and hide them in the back of the freezer. Then, just casually walk out of the front door like nothing ever happened. Now, let's get into today's stories. Our story begins with Fairjabber. By middle age, Fair was neither a brilliant detective nor a gun-wielding hero battling organized crime. He was an ordinary man, a patrol officer assigned to the small village of Analyas, just north of Beirut. To Fair, the police badge was not merely a symbol of authority. It was his family's only lifeline in a society already trembling with instability. He loved the job for the security it provided, and more than anything, he feared unemployment. That night, an anonymous call reporting a suspicious object on the beach pulled Fair and his partner out of the warmth of the station and into the storm. Under flashlights slicing through sheets of rain and crashing whitecaps, they found the victim. A man's body lay sprawled on the sand, clothes soaked and clotted with blood hardened by the cold. When they turned him over, both officers recoiled in revulsion. The victim's head had been severed cleanly with a single, precise stroke of a sharp blade. There was no head in sight. In a village so quiet it had never known a serious altercation, the presence of a headless corpse was an omen of something deeply sinister. Fair's partner, older, more seasoned, made a swift decision. He would return to the station to alert superiors and summon forensic personnel from Beirut. The village simply lacked the capacity to handle a homicide of this magnitude. He left Fair behind at the scene. "Listen carefully," he shouted over the rain. "This is the most serious crime this village has ever seen. Your job is to guard that body at all costs. Do not leave. Do not let the tide take it. And most importantly, do not fall asleep. I'll be back at first light." Fair remained there alone, swallowed by darkness and the presence of a headless corpse. The wind shrieked through the rocks like the lament of a restless spirit denied its final peace. At first, he fought to stay alert, pacing in a tight radius around the scene. But the cold seeped through his soaked overcoat, numbing his limbs. The stillness of the night, broken only by the sea's relentless roar, began to lull him into a dangerous trance. Around 3 in the morning, exhausted by cold and strain, Fair crouched behind a large rock for shelter from the wind. "Just 5 minutes," he told himself, "just to regain my strength." 5 minutes dissolved into hours. In his sleep, he dimly registered the rasp of shifting sand and the hush of moving water. Yet he could not force his eyes open. At dawn's first weak light filtering through gray mist, Fair jolted awake. Guilt struck like a blade. He sprang to his feet and rushed to the stretch of sand where the body had lain. It was gone. Nothing remained but churned sand smoothed by rain and tide. The corpse had vanished without a trace. Panic consumed him. He ran along the shore, tearing through piles of seaweed. Then he reached instinctively for his holster and felt emptiness. His service weapon, the emblem of his authority and responsibility, had been taken while he slept beside the dead. A cold current shot down his spine. He knew he was finished. Losing the body was already a catastrophic dereliction of duty. Losing his firearm meant prison and total ruin. Desperation edged into madness as he sprinted down the shoreline. clinging to the faint hope that whoever had taken the body had not gone far. Near the end of the beach, beside a weathered fisherman's hut, Ferd saw a man calmly chopping firewood in the yard. The man's composure was uncanny, as though the storm and the headless corpse had nothing to do with him. In Ferd's mind, a dark instinct took shape. A grotesque solution presented itself. If he killed this man, he could create a replacement body. He would remove the head and position the corpse where the original had lain. Without a head, no one could identify the victim. With similar clothing, or enough sand to obscure the details, he might salvage his career. What Ferd did not know was that the woodcutter was no innocent villager. He was the killer. After spotting the officer asleep, he had returned to reclaim the body and dispose of it properly. And, as an added precaution, he had taken Ferd's gun. He now stood confident that every trace had been erased. Ferd approached, his service knife trembling in his grip, but driven by resolve. The man turned, perhaps about to speak, perhaps reaching for the stolen weapon, but Ferd lunged like a cornered animal. They grappled violently on the damp earth. Fueled by raw desperation, Ferd overpowered him and ended his life. Then he committed an act of calculated brutality. He severed the man's head to fabricate the perfect substitute, dragging the still-warm body back to the beach. He washed away fresh blood with seawater and arranged the corpse to resemble what he remembered from hours before. When the sun climbed higher, his partner returned with detectives from Beirut. Ferd stood rigid, pale as the dead, clothes soaked and crusted with sand. "The scene is intact, sir," he reported, his voice trembling under the pretense of cold. But the city detectives were not easily deceived. One knelt beside the corpse and studied the clothing. "Officer Jabber," he said evenly, "your colleague's preliminary report stated the victim wore an old brown leather jacket. Why is this body dressed in a dark blue sweater and coarse trousers?" The question pierced whatever hope Ferd had left. Moreover, the blood surrounding the corpse was too fresh. It had not been washed away by the night's storm, as it should have been. His deception unraveled quickly under methodical scrutiny. In the interrogation room, crushed by psychological pressure, Ferd confessed to killing the stranger to conceal his negligence. Yet the most devastating truth awaited discovery when police searched the woodcutter's home. There, beneath a pillow, they found Ferd's missing gun. Beneath a concealed pit in the floor lay the original headless body, its severed head wrapped carefully in tarpaulin. When the head was brought before Ferd for identification, he let out a scream and collapsed. The first victim, the man abandoned on the beach, was Habib Jabber, his beloved cousin, the one he had always regarded as a brother. Habib had been attacked the night before while carrying a large sum of money home. Consider the cruelty of it. Ferd Jabber killed the very man who murdered his own brother. In a selfish bid to hide cowardice and incompetence, he had delivered justice in the most brutal form imaginable, without ever realizing it. He avenged his brother, and in doing so, transformed himself into a cold-blooded killer no different from the criminal he slew. Had he stayed awake, he might have captured the murderer alive. Had he chosen truth instead of substitution, he might have been remembered as a grieving hero. A Lebanese court ultimately convicted Ferd Jabber of premeditated murder. The fact that his victim was a robber and killer did not absolve him. The law cannot permit an officer to take a life to preserve his own reputation. Ferd entered prison carrying the weight of two deaths: the cousin he failed to protect and the man he killed in savagery. In Ananias, his story endures as a grim lesson about the fragile boundary between light and darkness within every human being. It is a reminder that fate has merciless ways of punishing deceit. When you stand before a headless corpse, be certain you possess the courage to face the truth, because if you do not, you may be the next to grasp the executioner's blade. Even now, locals say the quiet of Ananias Beach is sometimes shattered by the wind's wail, a sound they claim carries the distant cry of Ferd Jabber from the darkness of his cell, forever imprisoned in that fateful winter night of 1965. Never trust an easy solution to a grave mistake, because the price of deception may be everything you hold dear. How far would you go to conceal a single mistake? Would you dare trade an innocent life just to keep the police badge pinned to your chest? This story takes us back to Lebanon in 1965 to a night of violent wind and blinding rain along the shores of Ananias. A headless body vanished while the officer assigned to guard it drifted into sleep. A brutal decision was made in a moment of panic, and a horrifying truth was buried beneath sand still warm with human blood. Tonight, we step inside the mind of a man who was, at once, both victim and perpetrator, trapped in one of the cruelest twists fate has ever devised. By middle age, Faird was no brilliant detective and no gun-wielding hero battling organized crime. He was an ordinary man, a patrol officer in the small village of Ananias, just north of the capital, Beirut. To Faird, the badge on his chest was not a symbol of power or lofty justice. It was, quite simply, the only steady means of feeding his family in a society strained by economic hardship. He valued his job for the stability it offered, and more than anything, he feared the humiliation and uncertainty of unemployment. That night, an anonymous phone call reporting a strange object on the beach pulled Faird and his partner out of the warmth of the station and into the raging storm. Through flashlight beams slicing across sheets of rain and white-capped waves, they found the victim. It was the body of a man, clothes caked with sand and blood already stiffened by the bitter cold. But when they rolled the body over, both officers recoiled in disgust. The victim's head had been severed completely, removed with a single, precise cut, so clean it was chilling. The presence of a headless corpse in a village as quiet as Ananias signaled that something profoundly dark had crept into the community. Faird's partner, an older, more seasoned officer, made a swift decision. He needed to return to the station immediately to file a report and summon forensic investigators from the city. The village lacked the resources to handle a homicide of this scale. He ordered Faird to remain behind and secure the scene. "Listen carefully, Faird," he shouted over the pounding rain. "Your job is to guard that body at all costs. Do not leave. Do not let the tide take it. And most importantly, do not fall asleep. I'll be back at sunrise with the detectives." Faird stood alone in the darkness with the cold, headless corpse. The wind whistling through the rocks sounded like the wailing of a restless spirit. At first, he forced himself to stay alert, pacing the perimeter of the scene. But the cold began to seep through his soaked overcoat, numbing his limbs and eroding his resolve. The stillness of the night, punctuated by the steady roar of the ocean, began to cast a hypnotic spell over his frayed nerves. Around 3 in the morning, exhausted and half-frozen, Faird decided to sit behind a large rock formation to shield himself from the wind. He told himself he would close his eyes for only 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes turned into a deep, unbroken sleep that lasted for hours. In his dreams, he thought he heard the faint scrape of shifting sand, but he could not force his eyes open. When the first weak rays of dawn pierced the mist hanging over the shoreline, Faird jolted awake. He rushed to the stretch of sand where the headless body had been lying. It was gone. The spot was empty. The corpse had vanished without a trace. Panic overtook him as he ran frantically up and down the beach, but the disaster did not end there. When he reached for his holster, he found it empty. His service weapon had been taken while he slept. In that instant, an icy current shot down his spine. He knew his life as he knew it was over. Losing a body was a grave offense. Losing his firearm meant prison and the complete destruction of his honor. Driven to the brink of madness, Faird began running along the shoreline. At the far end of the beach, near a weathered fisherman's shack, he saw a figure. A man stood calmly chopping firewood in front of the hut, as if nothing in the world were amiss. The man's composure struck Faird as strangely unsettling, and then a dark, poisonous survival instinct surfaced in his mind. If I kill this man right now, I can create a new body. I'll sever his head and place him where the first one lay. Since the original corpse had no head, the detectives won't be able to identify the victim. I can save my career. What Faird did not know was that the man calmly splitting logs was the very murderer who had carried out the beheading the night before. When he had seen the officer asleep, He had returned to the beach, dragged the original body back to his shack to dispose of it, and taken Faird's gun as a final act of contempt. He stood there now, confident that he had erased every trace of his crime. Faird approached, his service dagger trembling in his hand, fueled by a desperate determination to kill in order to save himself. The stranger turned, barely registering what was happening before Faird lunged at him like a cornered animal. A bloody struggle followed. Powered by the ferocity of his desperation, Faird overpowered and killed the man. Then he committed an even more barbaric act. He used the same blade to sever the new victim's head, fashioning a replacement piece of evidence. He dragged the still-warm body back to the original spot on the beach, rinsed away the fresh blood with seawater, and arranged the corpse to resemble the earlier scene as closely as possible. By the time the sun had risen high, his partner returned with a team of experienced detectives. Faird stood there, pale and rigid, reporting, "The scene remains secure, sir." But the city detectives were not so easily deceived. One seasoned investigator knelt to examine the body closely. "Officer Jabber," he said, in the preliminary report, "the victim was described as wearing a brown leather jacket. Why is this body dressed in a dark blue sweater?" Beyond the clothing discrepancy, the detectives noted that the blood on the surrounding sand was far too fresh. It showed no signs of having been washed by hours of rain. Faird's clumsy deception unraveled quickly. In the interrogation room, he collapsed and confessed to the killing he had committed to cover his mistake. Yet the most devastating truth was still waiting to surface when police searched the woodcutter's shack. Inside the hut, they found Faird's service pistol and the first headless body hidden beneath the floorboards. When detectives produced the severed head of the original victim, Faird let out a raw, anguished scream before losing consciousness. The first victim was his closest cousin, Habib Jabber. Habib had been attacked the previous night while carrying a large sum of money home to his family. Faird Jabber had killed the very man who murdered his own cousin. In a selfish attempt to conceal his cowardice, he had delivered a savage form of justice without ever knowing it. He had avenged his relative, yet in doing so, he transformed himself into a cold-blooded killer no different from the criminal he despised. A Lebanese court later convicted Faird Jabber of premeditated murder. He walked behind prison bars bearing the crushing weight of two deaths: the cousin he failed to protect and the man he slaughtered in desperation. The story of Faird Jabber is still told as a haunting lesson about the fragile boundary between light and darkness. Fate has ruthless ways of punishing deceit. Never seek the easy escape when you have made a mistake, because the price of dishonesty may be everything you hold most dear. That's going to do it for today's stories. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know by leaving a comment and telling us what you thought about these cases. Or if you have any theories of your own, I'd love to hear them. Thank you so much for your support, and until next time, we'll see ya.